This is the Code of Practice from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and in it is a guidance on single-sex spaces that the government will put down. It is more than 300 pages long, and I'll read you some of the most important bits. Service providers will be allowed to exclude trans people from single-sex spaces if they decide other users could object to the presence of a trans person. If service providers allow trans women into women's-only spaces, it will not legally be regarded as a women's-only space. It also says that a gender recognition certificate obtained by a trans person does not change their sex in relation to the act. This is all after that landmark Supreme Court ruling on the definition of a woman, which the court said was based on biological sex. And that has caused organisations confusion when it comes to single-sex spaces. Everything from a gym, a swimming pool, a changing room, a toilet, to hospital wards, refuges. The Women and Equalities Minister, Bridget Phillipson, insists that trans people will still be protected. But the impact assessment is interesting. It says that generally we've assessed that changes which apply have a positive impact overall. However, the exception to this would be the gender reassignment protected characteristic, where we do think there are negative impacts.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. So we've finally received some clarification on how the Supreme Court ruling regarding the definition of a woman should be implemented in everyday life when it comes to women's spaces, when it comes to bathrooms, changing rooms. There's finally been some clarification, even though we all know what a woman is. We all know what it means to be female. Thankfully, the Supreme Court acknowledged what the Equality Act actually means when it affords people sex-based rights. These are rights based on whether one is male or female. And the definition of a woman, according to the Act, is one that is female, biologically speaking. So a piece of paper cannot turn a man into a woman and therefore allow that man to infringe upon women's spaces, to infringe upon women's rights. That man has his own rights. So single-sex spaces such as changing rooms and toilets must be used on the basis of biological sex. New guidance from the Equalities Watchdog has confirmed. This means, for instance, that a trans woman, a biological male who identifies as a woman, should not use female toilets or changing rooms, according to the Code of Practice. So the guidance produced by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission and now approved by ministers makes it clear that transgender people should instead be offered a third or gender-neutral space. So there's no pretending anymore. It's very clear who is male, who is female. It's very clear what sex-based rights are and how those rights are to be implemented on an everyday basis. So this comes after the landmark Supreme Court ruling last year that the definition of a woman under the Equality Act should be based on biological sex. It's very simple. The law never changed. This was just reinforcing the purpose of the Equality Act, to afford people rights based on biological sex. So MPs and peers have 40 days to raise any concerns. If there are no objections, the guidance becomes statutory.
It's just so heartbreaking, women, that women's rights and women's opportunities have just been so unimportant.
This is never about transphobia. This is about protecting women's space. You know, young girls in changing rooms and leisure centres, and in hospitals, places where they're vulnerable, places where they're unclothed. It's about safety.
Yeah, and it's about reality. It's about understanding that biological sex makes an absolutely massive difference. People are waking up. It's taken quite a long time because a lot of the media, apart from your good selves, were not very good at presenting the actual facts and the truth. So a lot of people were being gaslit constantly. And gradually, as time gone on, they've realised what women will be losing, and they've realised the loss of safeguarding.
Are you happy that this is the end of it?
Well, let's see. The MPs have got 40 days, to complain. I'm sure there will be a few complaining. I'm hoping that the government have a lot of more important things on their hands to be dealing with than this, and they will say, look, this is the law, and we want it left alone. And it's now up to us to try to find those neutral spaces. It's now up to us to make sure that we can include everybody in sport, that no one's left off.
Bridget Phillipson, we're finally hearing from her. Women and Equalities Minister said the aim of the guidance was to allow people to live free from discrimination and harassment. Our focus has always been making sure organisations have clear, accessible guidance on how to implement the law. And then it goes on to say that people who identify as trans can use single stool bathrooms, could use the disabled toilets. They also mentioned, unisex toilets and that sort of thing. So, of course, people with common sense, women who have pointed out the dangers of allowing men to use our spaces, celebrated this news, this long overdue guidelines. They celebrated it. But of course, we had those having a meltdown, acting as if people who identify as trans have nowhere to pee. Wherever shall they pee now? Acting as if this was direct discrimination against such people. This was the eradication of such people, the genocide of such people, not allowing men to use women's bathrooms and women's showers and changing rooms. Apparently that's discrimination, that's bigotry. So we had Owen Jones, who's a self-professed socialist and anarchist, had this to say: if trans women use men's toilets, they will be subjected to humiliation, abuse and violence. Anyone with any sense knows this, which is why in practice, trans women will not use men's toilets and will just increasingly be driven out of society. So of course people were pointing out the obvious, that you are admitting that it's the men who are a threat. And of course it makes sense to these people to therefore allow those men to use women's facilities, to be in the same spaces as women, of course, because of a policy that allows men to identify their way into women's toilets, women's showers, women's changing rooms, women's facilities of various kinds. Any man can access those spaces. It opens the door. It allows men, regardless of their intentions, to access those spaces. That's the reality that women are living with. And people like Owen Jones has no compassion for women, doesn't care about women, and couldn't care less that these policies endanger women. Many wade in to this illogical thinking, to this reckless thinking, and simply reminded Owen that who we are talking about here are men. You can put whatever silly label you want to put on them, but we're talking about men. And it makes no sense to say that men who are a danger to other men should therefore be allowed to have access to women, knowing full well that it's men who have the ability to overpower women on average, knowing full well that statistically it is women who are more vulnerable. It is women who are more open to assaults, to SA, to violence at the hands of men. So Graham Linehan called him a misogynist, and he said, "It's not misogyny to support the rights of trans people. It is a desperate smear and nothing else. It 100% is misogyny to repeatedly insist men deserve the right to violate female boundaries for their comfort at the expense of ours. Just effing own it. If women don't require single-sex spaces to be safe from men, why do trans women need access to women's single-sex spaces to be safe from men?" These are the same people who say it's not safe or fair for men who identify as trans to play sports against other men. But apparently it's safe for women to play sports against men. Make it make sense. J.K. Rowling weighed into this, saying, "Follow the logic. Women are deluded and naive for thinking predatory and violent men can be kept out of women-only spaces. They can rape you anywhere. However, trans-identified men can only be safe in women-only spaces because no abuser would ever follow them in there." And then he said, "The risk of a trans woman being abused or assaulted in the men's toilet per visit equals extremely high. The risk of a woman being abused or assaulted in the women's toilet per visit equals extremely low." Yeah, that's why we want to keep it women only and not have men being given access to those women's toilets. These people never fail to prove our exact point. That's exactly why we don't want men coming in there. All of these ridiculous arguments are on the premise of a lie. That's why they push their mantra, trans women are women. They push that and force that down people's throats because that's the only way they can justify making these points. In order to be a trans woman, you have to be a man. And that's exactly what they are. And everybody knows it. No amount of religious reciting of mantras is going to change that. So the risk of women being assaulted is greater when men are allowed in our spaces. In practice, this just means that trans people cannot use public toilets. Those championing this policy should just come out and be honest about that. They can use the men's. That's the most appropriate thing for them to do. They can use the men's or they can use the single stall bathroom. What is stopping the men who abuse men in the men's toilet, self-identifying as women, to get into the women's toilet? Nothing. That's the problem. Then why do you want us to allow men into safe female spaces? Tell your brethren to stay out of our women-only spaces, Owen. So you don't want trans-identifying males to feel threatened by the presence of other men when using communal toilets. But you're perfectly happy for women to be subjected to that same uncomfortable experience. Do you not see how illogical your argument is? They're not good faith actors. They're being very disingenuous, intellectually dishonest, and quite frankly, delusional. I am not going to use a third toilet for some bigot. It's insane. Rachel Millward did a video about her recently. This is a woman who believes that women can have penises. She said, "Today my heart is with our trans community, treated so abysmally in this country. Draft guidance means trans people are barred from services they could previously access, and inclusive service providers will be at legal risk." And in response to this delusional woman, J.K. Rowling said, "The Supreme Court has ruled that under UK law, trans people never had the rights people like you insist they had. You misrepresented the law and cheered on the removal of women's rights. Trans people have lost nothing except the mistaken belief you fostered. The Supreme Court clarified what the Equality Act actually means when it comes to affording rights to women, affording rights to men, sex-based rights. They just reinforced the fact that the Equality Act is referring to biological sex, not some made-up gender identity status. You can offer them a platinum private toilet just for them, a private throne. It won't matter. They will refuse. This has never been about safety. It's all a con. They are lying when they say it. Grant them the safest, most private alternative, and they won't use it. This is about forcing themselves into someone else's space, not about getting a space for themselves. Just ask, you'll see. Offer them their own space at considerable money and see the response. Try it. The same thing in women's sports. We've spoken about a separate category till we're blue in the face. Their own category. They don't want it. World Aquatics offered them their own category in swimming. No one showed up. They want everything else to be turned upside down, women and girls to be endangered, to be stripped of their rights, also that they can have their special privileges. And what's so ridiculous is that society did go along with it. The media conditioned people to go along with it. Those in positions of authority, in positions of power, conditioned people to go along with it and intimidated people so that people feared losing their jobs, people feared being smeared, losing their social media platforms, being demonetized, all of that. This is what's been happening for the longest time. And now they're losing, the hold that they had over people, and they cannot handle it. And the people who we were told were the disenfranchised are in fact the most privileged, self-entitled, arrogant, imposing people you could come across. And those who are melting down over some simple common sense guidelines finally being implemented, finally being laid out, all they're doing is exposing themselves, exposing who they really are and how they really feel about women. So thanks for watching. Like, comment and subscribe. Take care of yourselves, and God willing, I will see you in the next video. And a huge thanks to all of those who have hyped my videos. It is greatly appreciated.